Right, well, listen, it's lovely to welcome you, Nick. And it's lovely to see everybody else join us this month for our FASD awareness webinar. And we're delighted that these webinars have proved to be very useful to many of you, as we are constantly getting more and more attendees join us. So we'd love to welcome those that haven't yet seen our webinars. We hope you get an awful lot out of tonight's. And we're very happy to welcome Nick Barratt. Nick has been working in the field of positive behavioural support for 23 years. His clients include individuals with learning disabilities and autism, as well as people with no diagnosis, such as typically developing adolescents. Nick has extensive experience of working directly with clients and their carers, and provides clinical supervision to a range of professionals, including behavioural practitioners in the NHS teams. He is a member of the PBS Academy and chairs the Applied Behaviour Analysis Forum, a professionals group he co-founded in 2008. He also serves on the board of the UK Society for Behavioural Analysis and is a trustee of Pathways School, which is due to open this year. In 2014, Nick co-authored a book called Feeling Cross and Sorting It Out, which focuses on the interactional nature of challenging behaviour. Thank you, Nick, for joining us tonight. I've been looking forward to this one, particularly because my wife and I have been foster carers now for the past 20 years. And in all those years, we've focused primarily on specialising with individuals with autism or complex behavioural issues. And in the early days, we looked at positive behavioural support, or positive behavioural therapy as it was, and tried to use that as a form with our individuals to great success. So we're great advocates of it, and it's lovely to have you join us here today. Can you tell us, how did you get involved in this particular field of work?
Sure. I worked back in the late 80s got a job as a support worker, very much by accident. I had wasn't really thinking of having a career in behaviour support, social care, and it so happened that I was working with so these were community homes for people with learning disabilities and or autism, all of whom displayed some kind of challenging behaviour. So quite often physical aggression, quite serious self-injurious behaviour. And I guess prior to that, I'd always been a bit of I suppose, an armchair psychologist. I'd always been interested in what makes people tick, and always been really interested in science. And some of the people that I was supporting, in particular, people who were self-harming and sometimes hurting themselves quite badly, it really puzzled me. I thought, why would someone, for example, bang their head against a wall when it must be extremely painful? What is it? There must be a reason. There must be a reason for this. And as the years went on, became more and more interested in those types of questions. And I did some studying back in, this would have been the year 2000, actually. And then that's really when I started to work in, actually, it was in 1999, it was. And that, I guess, was when I started really to get into positive behaviour support. And I started taking on referrals for people whose behaviour is challenged, and using a behavioural science and applied behaviour analytic approach to understand the behaviour and help people find alternatives to, for example, self-injurious behaviour. And I did that for a while. I studied some more, and took it as far as I could go in terms of becoming a Board Certified Behaviour Analyst, which requires a sort of a bunch of supervised experience, and you take an exam. And at that point started sort of managing people, as well as managing other consultants, as well as still doing the direct work. So I was really fortunate in that I was able to get involved in some sort of quite large scale project. So looking at something called setting-wide positive behaviour support is, as the name suggests, it's positive behaviour support, but applied to sort of hundreds of people, or however many. So what's been very helpful for me, I've been very fortunate, I guess, is that I've been able to use a positive behaviour support with individuals, with groups of people, with organisations, and work with other practitioners to sort of supervise them in their practice. And then you mentioned the PBS Academy and UK Society for Behaviour Analysis. These, I guess, what those aspects of what I do have in common is that it's about raising standards. It's about improving the quality of behaviour support in the UK. So that was it, I guess. Armchair psychologist, hooked by those early experiences, and still very interested.
And when would you say that PBS really came into its own? Because I mentioned that in 20 years of fostering, we've seen so many different styles of therapeutic care, if you like, and methods and techniques that we've been trained to observe and try and practice. When did you start feeling that PBS was something that people were taking seriously?
I think probably it was the late 90s. I've actually got one of the first books on my shelf there that was published on PBS, and the first course I ever did was at the Tizard Centre in University of Kent. And it was, I think I started in the PBS field in 1999. I think 2000, I went there and studied, and they were talking about positive behaviour support then. And around that time, an American researcher, Carr, was talking about the evolution of this new applied science, as he called it, which was PBS. And then I think in England, or in the UK, I should say, what happened was, and I don't know if you're familiar with this, or maybe the people listening in are, Winterbourne View, the scandal at Winterbourne View, which was a care home where people whose behaviours challenged were being treated terribly. And that was a real sort of positive behaviour support was seen as a way of preventing those types of events from occurring again. So that was a real springboard. And a lot of my colleagues in the PBS Academy wrote a paper, when would this have been? 2013, I think, that sort of redefined PBS for a UK context. And that really launched it, because then lots of commissioners of services for people whose behaviours challenged said, okay, we need to do what these guys are telling us to do here, and develop the skills of services and practitioners to implement PBS. So I think early 2000s, but then in the UK really got going sort of, 2010, 2012, around about then.
On a very elementary level, we've seen it in practice with many of the individuals that come into foster care. All their life, they've been beaten down with being accused of this, being accused of that. And we'll come on to some of the behaviours with FASD, which covers the same sort of thing. But when you believe that everything you're hearing is negative, you begin to beat yourself down. You believe that you're a naughty boy. We've always used the analogy, you're not naughty, sometimes you just do naughty things. And with PBS, the positivity, we try and use positivity in our teaching in the classroom. We try and use positivity in home with our families. Can you give us some of the details about why positivity is so important in your teaching?
Absolutely. And if I've actually not got my self view on, Andrew, so if it becomes dark in here, tell me. And
You're fine.
I'm okay.
Yeah.
So and actually there was an interesting point you made about people being beaten down, and that positivity. And I think there's something else I'd like to add to that it's obviously from an ethical perspective, from a values-based perspective, we should be supporting people and not beating them down and building them up. And I'll talk a bit about the constructional perspective in positive behaviour support. You address behaviours of concern by actually adding to people's skill sets. So that's the constructional part. But as well, everything we know about human behaviour supports the fact that people aren't, they're not intrinsically naughty or intrinsically bad. We all, every human being, we all learn what works for us in a given situation. So now, the context is a webinar. So I'm not dancing on the table. I'm engaging in behaviours that have worked for me in the past. Yeah. So the environment is constantly telling us out how to behave. Now, if you rewind back to when everyone knows what I mean if I talk about the terrible twos. So there was a time in all of our developments when we engaged in behaviours that could be described as challenging. It's accepted, it's something a 2-year-old does. Now, some people, because of their developmental trajectory, as they move forward through the years, they may not acquire some of the skills that provide them with alternatives to those. So they can be stuck with some of these behaviors, but it's nothing to do with being intrinsically bad or naughty. It's just, you've got a different size toolkit. And that often is where PBS can help, where a lot of us who are typically developing, maybe we pick up things just from seeing it around us. We learn by watching others. We're told something once, we get it, we put that into practice. With PBS, often what we're doing is more formal, systematic, rigorous training methods to teach those alternative behaviors. But teach is the operative word. Yeah. So it's looked at as a skills deficit, behaviors that can be described as challenging. It's a skills deficit, and we've got to provide people with another way of getting that whatever need the behavior meets, we've got to provide them with another way to do that.
I'm also very interested when you mentioned that you focused on a lot of autistic individuals. I can see why that would be the case because of the nature of autism. But I'm also very interested to hear about you developing adolescents as well.
Yeah.
And I think we can all understand, we've all been developing adolescents, but I'm going to just touch on that for the moment, if I may. Where do you see PBS, particularly at that time in one's life? Because and we'll be going into specifically FASD in a bit, but a lot of transitioning from child services to adult services. Those that have listened to these webinars have heard us sort of mention on many occasions the difficulties that many of our families have with particularly transitioning from child services to adult services, whether it's in adoption, whether it's in special guardianship, or whether it's in foster care and in birth families as well. So can you tell us a little bit about the difficulties and particularly the areas of work that you focus on at that time?
So the typically developing adolescents, so the age range is round about, I think the earliest is probably 10, 11, up to about 18. And this was part of an initiative, a local authority in Kent that they were looking at adolescents, young people as they call them, who they're starting to come to the attention of social services. Some actually are needing input from CAMS teams, but who maybe are not quite there yet. So it's almost an early intervention approach, and how maybe they can get some help now that will prevent them from requiring a more comprehensive services, more community team-based services in the future. And the types of problems that come through, quite often it's conflict within the family. So referrals will say parents will report that the child doesn't respect boundaries, won't do chores or homework. I think it's one of the questions that you were emailing me about. That that sometimes in more serious cases there can be physical aggression from children directed at parents, directed at siblings. There are times the behavior could be that the young person is staying out all night and maybe spending time with people who are encouraging them to engage in criminal activity, or sort of hanging about with people where they put themselves at risks. Now, interestingly, and this might have been the experience of some of the people listening in today, following COVID, what we've found is a lot of kids, now, I know that this has happened with children with autism, but interestingly, with typically developing children who maybe never really liked school, but kind of coped with it because they just went all the time. It was what you did. Having time off during COVID, now having to go back, hugely aversive for them. So, and some it's even extended to where they won't leave the house. So quite a few of the children we're working with, it's about how to increase their confidence, how to desensitize them actually to the outside world again. So we've been doing some work on that. So quite a range of behaviours of concern, but a real emphasis on, particularly with sort of conflict within families, equipping people with a different way of doing it so as to change those unhelpful patterns. It's no one's fault, it's what happens when people are together over long periods of time, but unhelpful patterns can develop. And there are some really useful strategies that PBS can introduce in those situations that can just kind of turn those patterns around a little bit.
Absolutely. And you were very kind enough to attend one of our parent carers support groups last month. And I think you found it very interesting listening to the conversations that were had from many of our families and their day-to-day difficulties and challenges with the behaviours of many of their individuals. But now it was interesting, some of the things you picked up there are things that we hear on a daily basis, particularly following COVID. There are a lot of difficulties that many of our families are having to manage with going back to school. And actually, school is one of those areas. I'll pick out one particular area that a lot of our families struggle with, and it is the transitioning for many of our FASD individuals that they might behave really, really well and be challenged and focused at school, but the moment they come home, it breaks down. It might be the reverse. They might be great at home and challenged at school, or the behaviours are more challenging at school. Can you talk a little bit about that and maybe come up with some of the strategies that you use to help some of the families?
Absolutely. And what, as we're getting into strategies now, what I'll do, if it's okay, Andrew, is share my usual caveat whenever I do these types of talks.
Please do.
And what I'll talk about is what's been useful for certain people, but obviously without having assessed anyone that we have questions about today, I can't make specific recommendations. It wouldn't be ethical, but happy to talk about what's worked for people with similar problems. So one of the key initial processes in positive behavior support is something called functional behavior assessment. And what that really is, it's figuring out why the behavior occurs. And it might sound obvious that should be the first step, but actually sometimes in behavior support, people adopt a bit of a try it and see methodology. And it's not, I would always urge people to, try to sort of get some sense of why the behavior occurs in the first place. We know from research, knowing the function of the behavior, knowing the purpose it serves for the individual is twice as likely to lead to a successful behavior support strategy. We know that from research than if you don't do that. So step one is always to try to figure out what is the function for that individual, because whilst two different people who are displaying the same behavior Yeah, it might look exactly the same in terms of its form. So as they're heading out, to go to school, there's shouting and, throwing their bag on the floor, but it could have very different functions depending on their learning history. So for one, it could be, I get to go back indoors. For another, it might be that there's some enticement with some kind of reward. And the young person has learned, okay, if I do this, then I get this nice thing. So we can have, it's always important not to base it on form, but, on what the behavior means for that particular person. So another core principle in the science that underpins PBS, behavior analysis, is that context, environments tell us how to behave. So if ever someone is referred to me and I'm being told that behavior is occurring in one setting and not another, I want to dig a bit deeper into that. What is it that evokes that behavior, let's say at school and not at home? And the kind of questions are, what is there something that someone else says or does? Is it a particular physical environment? Is it a time of day? These are the types of questions that you want to be asking. And because once we know about that, let's say that when someone goes to school and goes straight into maths, there's more likely to be an incident. Well, there might be some scope for doing something else first, and when we might see a reduction in incidents. Is someone being bullied? That's come up for some of our the typically developing kids that we're working with. So then that leads to, okay, now we need to come up with some strategies that maybe help you work on your assertiveness skills or help you work on what to do when this happens. So some kind of contingency planning. So step one is finding out what's going on. If it turns out it's to do with, struggling in class, and this is and actually a really good question always to ask is, let's say school is the place where there are incidents. Is it in every lesson? Is there ever a lesson where there's never an incident? And that can lead you down a path that really elucidates what's going on for the person. And it might be that if they're in a class where maybe the teacher isn't as good at slowing things down, breaking tasks down into steps, then there can be some behaviors of concern. Or the person's learned with this particular teacher, all I have to do is throw my pencils off the desk and they send me to the headmaster. And that's brilliant, because now I escape this horrible aversive classroom. So always starting point is to figure out what the behavior is about, and then the strategies can follow.
And I'd like to come in on this, if I may, because I always find it's really important to have a sympathy with a classroom teacher.
Mm-hmm.
Well, because many of the classroom teachers have got to manage many different behaviors in the classroom at once. Sometimes they react to what they see presented before them because they need to think of the overall class. Also, many individuals in the classroom, or many of the staff, they only have a very limited amount of experience in working with special educational needs.
Indeed.
And so, whilst I sympathise with our individuals, our cases with FASD and in the care system, but I still sympathise also with the teachers in how they manage it. And when we go into the classroom and we educate Senkos, or we do a training seminar with a lot of teachers in teacher training to be able to help them understand what to look for, how to manage behaviours that are particularly focused on FASD. Once they start to understand and pick apart that, it really helps them with their job. Is this something that when you come up with an analysis and you've done your picking apart and you've found what needs to be done, where do you go with that then?
And absolutely agree with the point about educating people on that. As a behaviorist, this is what I said earlier. Our behavior is determined by the environment, and teachers, doctor, you know, everyone, this applies to everyone. So it certainly wasn't, in my example, I wasn't criticizing the teacher in that example. And actually, for the last couple of years, one of my supervision groups, it's different professionals. So it's occupational therapists, teachers in schools who all have had some training on PBS. And now I meet with them every few months to talk about cases to help them embed that. And for a lot of the teachers, that is exactly what you've just described. It's learning about behavior. It's learning what strategies can be helpful. And actually, there are times where a teacher really, on his or her own, can't really change the behavior. You need teaching assistants. You need them to be coming in and prompting the young person to use their strategy, whatever it is that you've worked on. In behavior support, something we do a lot is we kind of scale things back in terms of the demand. So we're actually doing this with a few of the typically developing kids at the minute. They, as a way of getting them back into school, they're not attending at all. So a sympathetic school will say, okay, come for an hour. And that's how we're gradually increasing it. And sometimes starting for 15 minutes and then let's go and do something nice, and then 20 minutes. So gradually increasing the demands whilst giving someone the skills to say, okay, I've had enough, as opposed to, you know, throw the desk over and swear at people. But it almost desensitized them to the demands that are placed on them. So gradual increasing of whatever that task demand is. And that's an approach that can be applied to homework, for example. So your son or daughter just won't do their homework. Well, let's ask them to do 5 minutes of it, and then it's their favorite dinner. And tomorrow it's going to be 10 minutes and it's something else. So you're gradually increasing the demand for whatever it is that's pleasant after. But that can be a way of easing people into doing the behavior that's required, but without a lot of the conflict.
Yeah. And I totally agree. I think a learning support assistant that understands the conditions and understands the individual, because every individual, particularly in our area, everyone with FASD, the spectrum is so vast that, you know, I love the quote, when you see one individual with FASD, it's one individual with FASD. And I think one of the things that crops up time and time again with our families that they struggle with, and we see it daily, is transitioning. And I know when we talk to a lot of the learning support assistants in the schools, their difficulty in managing and what they have to prepare is transitioning. So transitioning from classroom to classroom, transitioning from break time into the classroom. Can you give us some strategies that you would use? You mentioned about talking about homework, but what sort of strategies would you encourage for an LSA in a school to be able to work on transitioning?
Sure. So I would always, again, start with some questions about, so let's focus now on a particular child, because ultimately you have to start with one child. So is it every single transition? Is it leaving school to go home? Is it arriving in the morning, regardless of the lesson? Is it a transition from maths to gym, for example? Or is it a transition from, you know, any lesson to break time, for example? And then I would always be looking at, if once you've sort of, if it's everything, okay, I'll come back to that. But let's say we identify, I'll use a real life example, someone who struggled with break time. Well, as we delved into that a little bit deeper, the person struggled because when it was in a lesson, everything was very structured. They knew the rules, they knew what to do. But break time now, you know, social situation, it's very different. They didn't know how to initiate a conversation. They didn't know how to respond if someone was joking with them. So it wasn't really about the transition. Here we're going to do something different. It was about, let's teach this person how to have a conversation. So I share that as an example of how there's no substitute for figuring out what's underpinning it. Now, there are some people who struggle, and I guess this is a best practice strategy in autism. It's used a lot with, because transitions there, it's a commonly cited challenge for a lot of people, and increasing predictability. So I've worked with people in the past where we've had a video of what happens when they get there, as a way of letting them know what's coming. And if the underlying cause is a lack of predictability, a lack of understanding of what to do in the activity or setting our transition to, that can be helpful, if that's what's going on. But it is often, I can't think of many people I've worked to where it was every single transition. It was usually a bit more nuanced when you sort of pulled it apart, I guess.
I know that one of the techniques that we've often used is now and then.
As a predictability, yes.
And so we will always anticipate that challenge of transition. So, for example, let's say it's a simple challenge at home. We're going to be going out in 15 minutes. Yeah. Now, if we spring that on our individuals, then there's uproar. But if we say, right, in 15 minutes, we're going to go out, we're going to start getting our shoes on, and we're going to turn the television off, and we're going to go out. We're dealing with that's then. Now, I'm letting you know that we've got 15 minutes. Then we come to the point where, okay, 5 minutes, boys, let's get shoes on now. We're going to turn the television off. So that you've preempted things, which is a strategy that becomes natural for us because you do it day in, day out. Now, one of the difficulties that I came across, and it was one of the questions that came up time and time again, is when individuals are in traffic and they're in cars. Sitting in cars is a regular nightmare for many of our kids. And we ourselves at our home have a young lad, anytime we change lane, he screams. Anytime there's a traffic light, he screams. And we're so used to it, but it's a scream like a banshee. It's so loud. And it can really interfere with everybody else because it will happen constantly. Now, with what sort of strategies or techniques? I know it's difficult because I've just sprung it on you, but are there any examples that we could use to help distract or to help focus or anticipate? We've mentioned, right, I'm going to be changing lane coming up here because this lane is only used for overtaking. And so we'll try that on occasions, but sometimes you forget to do these.
It doesn't necessarily work. Yeah, it's a good question. So one principle that can be applied there is teaching someone to do an incompatible behavior. So something that you can't be doing it while screaming. So it could be singing a song at normal volume, for example. That might be an alternative, or it might be doing some kind of plaything, something like that. Actually, that might not. Maybe you can scream and do that, so that might not be the best example.
Give it a go.
So what you can do is you can look at teaching someone to do something else, but obviously, if you were to say, okay, do this in several, why would they be motivated to do it? So you can, depending on, let's say this is a young person, it can be an adult as well, but let's say the young person is able to understand some kind of token reward system, something like that. So you've got the chance now, we're going in the car to earn a bunch of tokens. Yeah. So instead of when you see the traffic lights, what I want you to do is, and this incompatible behavior, and here's the token. When you get a bunch of those, it's exchanged for, a prize. So for someone who is operating on a cognitive level that makes that possible, that can be a useful strategy. Now, again, my caveat about, depends very much on the person. If it would depend a lot on the function. So is it that the traffic lights are experienced as frightening in some way, or is the changing lane frightening for someone? If so, then you might want a different type of strategy. You might want something that is more along the lines of a desensitization, perhaps coupled with some relaxation techniques. So I'm a real fan of diaphragmatic breathing because it's an easy one to teach, belly breathing. You put your hand on your belly button. If you breathe out and your hand moves, if you breathe in, your hand moves, you're doing it properly. And you can teach this to people really, really well. So I want you to do that now. And as we're coming up to the lights, do your breathing and, whatever. And then here's the reward, or look what a great job you did. Yeah. So it's going to depend very much on, what it is that motivates that. If it's become something of a habit, then I think maybe the token system to do something else is more likely to be effective. And in terms of increasing the likelihood of success with all of those, if there's a way, what we do a lot, I refer to it as staging when you're trying to teach someone a skill. So that means creating a bit of a force environment initially. But if there's a particular road at a particular time of day where it's safe, for example, to stop, what you might find is that someone who, let's say it's some kind of, fear response to changing lanes or traffic lights, what you might find is that parking, 100 meters away from those traffic lights does not evoke the scream. Yeah. So you gradually get a bit closer. Now do your breathing a bit closer. And then, okay, that's it for today. You did really well. You come back again, gradually desensitize the person to it. So very much depends on underlying cause, but hopefully there are a few potential strategies there.
No, very fascinating. Another area is sleep. At time, getting routines. Many of our individuals, and I know a lot of the individuals with autism that you've worked with, the routine of sleep and the problems of sleeping habits and not being able to get to sleep or waking up and disturbing the household in the early hours of the morning and sort of moving around the house. These are things that we hear on a regular basis, particularly with young ones. And we've always been of the thinking that the earlier you can establish techniques and positive habits, the better for everybody in the long term.
Definitely.
Now, talking about, you mentioned earlier about the token techniques. What other strategies or methods could we use that you've found to be very effective in rewards?
Right. Okay. Well. So do you want to talk about rewards or ways of addressing sleep?
Well, if we first of all go with the rewards and then if we can come in on the sleep, that would be really
sure. So rewards, again, very, very individual. It could be, well, I'll give you a real life example. So here's actually this puts into practice a few of the things that we just talked about. So one young man, he high functioning autism, no learning disability. His room was a tip, and he was someone who was taking apart computers. He was just really interested in them, and often he'd drop bits on the floor, step on them, and cut his feet. And there was food wrappers everywhere. He was tripping over things. But if anyone asked him to tidy up, there'd be, he would swear and tell them to get lost and so on. But he loved playing Xbox with other family members, sometimes even his dad. And so what we did, we used a system, we used playing Xbox with dad. That was the reward. So that was the individual reward for him, coupled with a gradual increasing of the task demand. So what we talked about earlier. So with a bit of help, dad would go in. So this is day one, if you like. And the young man was often saying, "Will you play Xbox?" So I say, "Okay, yeah, I'll come up and play." Walk in the room and say, "Could you we're all ready to play. Just put those socks in the basket." Okay, excellent. Okay, let's play. Immediately play. Yeah. So the reward. So you know where I'm going with this. Next day it was, "Could you put the socks in the pants? Could you pick that screw up and put that on?" And in that way, we backward chained those sequences of behaviors to where he was tidying his room and playing on Xbox. So you can use rewards for lots of different things there. The token system works with, people who either can make the cognitive link between something I earn now and something I get later, or you use a creative visual system for something that sort of stacks up and it's an obvious top, and then I get it. You can do different things like that. Rewards can be, it can be something nice to do. It can be, it can be something to watch on TV. It can be a million different things. I had a supervisee who's working with the typically developing children. We talk a lot in our work with families about catching them doing good.
Yes.
And this is about that, turning that pattern, that unhelpful pattern around, where we get, everyone's a bit fraught, everyone's a bit stressed, and you're kind of, humans are geared up to react when things go wrong, and that's all that sort of, all of the interactions are characterized really by people having a go at each other, and what one of these strategies is, when you see the young person doing something that's, they say something nice to their brother, they put that spoon, within a few feet of the kitchen sink, is to thank them for it. Yeah. So it's got, now praise doesn't necessarily work. Well done from a mum and dad who, aren't getting on well with their son, it might not be received as praise. So people come up with creative alternatives. And my supervisee said, what about writing a post-it note saying, I'm really proud of you for using your strategy? And it was a wonderful story, this, because when my supervisee went back to check on how the family were doing, the young person was sticking them up on their cupboard, all of the notes that were praising them. And it really turned that relationship around between, mother, son, father and son.
I like that.
I think I went off a bit there. Did I answer your question?
I really like that, because the reason I was smiling was because I can absolutely identify with that. We've had two individuals that came into care with us several years ago, and one of the difficulties that we had at the time was there were behaviors that one had ADHD and autism, and was banging around the house all the time, craving the attention, trying to get as much attention from the other. The other had chromosome depletion and autism, and was pretty non-verbal. And one would encourage the other to scream and react, and we knew what was going on. My own two birth children would observe what was going on, and you could see the tension building and the anxiety in the room. And then as soon as the one that was actually creating the most backed off, I remember my wife and I discussed this, and we'd worked on positive behavioural support. And we had these little jelly sweets. They were tiny little sugar-free jelly sweets, because otherwise they'd be getting through far too much sugar. So we got these little jelly sweets, and we'd say, do you know what? Open up the jelly pop. For what you did there, you backed off and you started to walk away, and I want to congratulate you for that. That was really good. And our boys even started doing it with themselves, with each other. And everyone was looking for this jelly sweet as the goal. And the behaviours started to change. And certainly, one of the things I wanted to pick up on there was, for me and for my wife, to be able to reward rather than be constantly nagging, it's far more of a healthy environment to
Absolutely.
So I think that was a really good example. Thank you for that. Going back to the sleep patterns, if I may.
Yeah, sleep. Okay.
We've used a lot of strategies like blacking out the lights and putting a black marker pen over a tiny little light that they'll focus on a television at night that nobody else would think of. All these little exercises, and they all help. But what sort of things do you find you come across quite often, and some of the strategies that help?
So I've used a few different things over the years, actually, and one of the most challenging actually was someone who was blind and had quite a severe learning disability. Now, most people know about the effect that light has on the chemicals in the brain that tell us to sleep or wake up, and so that was gone. She couldn't respond to that. And with her and with a few other people, we've worked on almost making daytime really sort of meeting people's physical needs. So you use a bit of energy, but also you're fulfilled and not anxious, so helping people be calm. Obviously things like, not having coffees and cokes after a certain time, that these, I guess, are sort of fairly straightforward things. But for her, we were using songs. So a song for in the morning, getting up, because she had a severe learning disability and couldn't see that it was bright. And as well as a bunch of other activities, like at night, having a bath, certain smells, to cue her into going to sleep, and then a going to bed song as well. We were doing things like that. So that was probably one of the most challenging scenarios that I've worked with. And then there are, if again, sounds a bit obvious, but if you know the cause, then obviously your strategies should reflect that. So I've worked with people who just struggle not to, even though they're now, 10, 11, 12 years old, struggle to be apart from mum, sleep in their own bed. So that, again, it's a gradual desensitization. So and I should say, actually, wherever possible, these types of strategies should be developed collaboratively. So a lot of the typically developing kids we're working with, it's collaborative. There are behavioural contracts that all parties have to adhere to. I won't nag you to do your homework if you always have it done by 7. That was one strategy we came up with. So it's important to be collaborative, but coming back to sleep, it is sort of working on these things together, and actually that reminds me of there are obviously, the specifics are great. We have to that example of someone who can't sleep in their own bed. Then the collaborative part is, well, what do you want to try? Do you want to try 5 minutes on your own and then mum comes in, or she leaves at the end, or she goes away for a while? So there are different ways of doing that. But there are actually, when it comes to sleep, there are some general strategies that reflect what we know from behavioral science. And one of the problems that can occur, and this applies to all of us actually, I've shared this with colleagues who have problems sleeping, and it's helped them. It's viewed as a problem of contextual control, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So I talked earlier about how contexts tell us how to behave. So an obvious example, you're walking down the road on your mobile phone and you step into a library, you switch it off and lower your voice. Yeah, that's just an obvious example of that. But what can go wrong for a lot of us, particularly nowadays with laptops and mobile phones, is the rooms in our house tell us to do a whole muddle of things, whereas before the bedroom was for sleeping in, the office was for working in. Now, and particularly in COVID, I did a talk for a bunch of solicitors on this, about the challenges of working from home in COVID. And this is something that I spoke with them about. One of the worst things you can do is sit on your bed with your laptop answering work emails, because what you're teaching yourself is that the bed now has a different purpose, and it will start to evoke different behaviors that relate to work. You don't want that at 3 a.m. So coming back to the FASD and how we can apply that to people that we might, family members, people that we're working with, really good rule of thumb is to make the bedroom as geared up for sleep only as is possible. Now, I realize that this you have to sort of do what's doable here, but for some people that could be toys. All toys are put away by 8 p.m., for example. For older children, maybe there's an agreement about when the Xbox goes off. In the time leading up to going to bed, you start to substitute stimulating activities for more low arousal activities. You start to dim lights. This actually helps in terms of preparing us physiologically for sleep. If you do wake up in the night, so the behavioural analytic treatment for insomnia is if you can manage to do it, if you're awake for more than 15 minutes, get out of bed. Don't stay there, because if you lay there trying to go back to sleep or lay there thinking about a million things, again, it's that problem with contextual control. You're teaching your brain that bed in the dark is the place where I think about things. Yeah. So go away, go have a glass of milk, read something boring, not stimulating. And if you're up for an hour, you're up for an hour, and go back to bed. At least you're not teaching yourself the wrong behavior. So those are a few tips.
These are very good. We had a discussion today about bedtime routine in one of our support groups, and in our house, what we have for one of our lads, we've got these 2 metal lockers that are like school lockers, and I had to drill in to put a latch on it that I can actually put one of those key coded locks.
Yeah.
So every night, everything goes in there, locked away. That's night time. We've switched off, and that strategy has worked very, very well for him.
Yeah.
Now, if there's one thing on the floor that he's hidden, I will normally know, because it will be out of place in that locker, and I will know it's missing in that locker. But that works for us, and it was a strategy that we found happened overnight. It just changed the way that we acted. Now, the other great advantage, and we had this conversation today, was finding apps for mobile devices, so that as parents, we know that app will switch off all devices from that time until that time in the morning. Excellent. And that way they know there is no way of getting back on a device.
Yeah.
So if they come out their room and they try and get onto a iPhone or try to get onto their tablet, it will not work for them. Yeah. And once there's that knowledge, they can switch down that part of the brain to say, okay, I don't need to know this. We've moved on. Yeah. And it'll go to something else, no doubt. But no, that was a really useful example. Thank you for that. Now, I know we're coming towards the end, but I'd like to touch on something that I think, you've brought up before, that I think is really important, and it's something that we bring up time and time again. And it's about, as parents, we are programmed into parenting in a certain way because of our own parents. And the more training that you do, the more you work with individuals with complex needs and behavioural issues, we have to adapt the way we parent to them. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that one of the things that we talk a lot with parents about is that our starting point is, it's not, you're not bad parents. We're human. We get into patterns. I always refer to it as patterns of interaction that are either helpful or unhelpful. So first off, don't beat yourself up about it. That's number one. Number two is behavior. Unless it's happening, where someone's away from everyone else on their own, there's no one else about. It's almost always an interaction, and the types of behaviours that were often referred for intervention. It's usually some kind of interaction between people. So if what you've done to date isn't successful, then let's try another way. Let's try another way, and a starting point is often to think about, I suppose, how are expectations communicated in your household? Is there a degree of clarity and consistency? Are people really clear on what's being asked? Okay, is there some room for negotiation here? So the example I touched on earlier about homework, that was a real life example. So arguments, sort of quite animated sort of verbal arguments, were occurring because parents were repeatedly asking the young man to do his homework, and he was saying, "You're nagging me. I'm playing Xbox in a cross-play game with my friends. You keep interrupting," and so on. So we got them to agree on a behavioural contract, and they signed it. They each party signed it, and the agreement was that in this household they had their dinner at about 6:30. So the young man got home, I think, about 4 p.m. And as long as he had his homework done before he sat down for dinner, his parents would not say a word about, "You need to do your homework." And it was written like a legal contract. So I, Simon Peterson, agreed to, and so that type of, now obviously, parents are parents. There are certain, it's right that kids, follow the rules, but that, what I've found is if there's a degree of negotiation, if there's a degree of ownership and the child having a say, where that's possible in what's happening, that can be a really good way forward. So I suppose those would be the tips. Really clear expectation, consistency around response, and understanding that behaviors occur for a reason, to get some kind of result, and that nothing is fixed in stone. If it leads to a different result, or if the need is met before the challenging behavior has to occur, then it won't occur.
Flexible and adaptable in your own expectations as well of yourself. I'm just going to finish with one last question that's come up, actually, and I think it's a really very valid point. You mentioned it was one of the first things that you noticed in your early work, and that was the self-harming, the technique of self-harming, where that comes from, and what sort of positive behavioural support you can use for that. And if we can make that our last point, that I think that would be really useful to some of our families.
Okay, so I'll reiterate something I said earlier about the form a behaviour takes, or what it looks like, for example, and versus its function. So I'll give you a real life example. I worked with a young woman, actually, late 20s, who she couldn't speak. She had autism and a severe learning disability, and she would self-harm by striking herself around the cheek. Now, depending on what was going on around her, that behavior was communicating, "Stop asking me to do something, play my favorite CD, or sit next to me." So the behavior was the same in terms of its form, but depending on whether she'd not had anyone spending time with her, depending on whether at that moment someone was saying, "Can you help me with the laundry?" it had a different function. So the key is to figure out what is it that's underlying the behavior. And broadly speaking, behavior, you can think of it as achieving two types of outcomes for someone. One is an outcome that requires someone else to deliver. So I self-harm because someone brings me a cup of tea. I self-harm because they don't insist that I get on the school bus. The other type of outcome is what we call automatic. So this is a behavior that achieves its reinforcing, its rewarding consequence without the mediation of another person. So it's one that changes internal levels of sensory stimulation. So I worked with someone who would lick her hand and wipe saliva on her face. Now, she didn't do it to get attention, to make people go away, anything else. It was purely because of how it tasted. Because of how it felt. and potentially the smell as well. And I'll tell you what our intervention was for that. But my initial hypothesis was it's tactile and it's the smell. So that's where I went with that. So depending on what the function is, you could come up with, okay, another example. A man used to self-harm when he was being asked to help with kitchen chores. So we taught him how, this was in the day before we had nice apps and voice output communication aids. We taught him to hand someone a red card as a way of saying, I don't want to do it, okay, instead of self-harming. Now, if we've got time, I can talk about the procedure for teaching that to someone who's nonverbal. But so we taught him another way of achieving the same outcome as challenging behavior, but without self-harming. So that's a core approach in behavior support. What need does the behavior meet? How else can the person achieve it? Or another strategy would have been, don't ask him to help with the chores. But that's one that it's often an important initial strategy, but it doesn't teach someone a skill they can use themselves. So that was that. So that's an example of one that involved another person. The lady who was licking her face and wiping the saliva, we figured it was probably a smell or a tactile thing. So she was in a staffed service. We got the staff to have regular beauty sessions with her. So she would get all different smells, these creams that had different scents. And we taught her to go and point to them. And then staff would do that with her and spend, half an hour with all these lovely creams and perfumes. And that provided an outcome that was similar enough, maybe even better than the outcome that she was achieving through if you like, the challenging behavior, and the challenging behavior decreased.
And that's brilliant. Thank you so much. But one of the things that I'm becoming increasingly aware of through what you're saying is that you identify what the core issue is, as you said. And many of our parents and carers, they know those individuals. They know the behaviors. They know those habits. And so they will we're all sort of geared to reading in between the lines, aren't we? Mm-hmm. And so we're probably the most qualified people there to be able to identify what the cause issue is, and for us to work out ourselves sometimes what strategies, what techniques, what examples we can experiment with to try and find some sort of resolution to solving these problems. I've got to say, Nick, it's been an absolutely fascinating talk, and I could talk to you for hours and hours. And I know we've got quite a few questions have come up here from people that just want to keep going and going and going. Just so that everybody knows, we will be putting this webinar on our YouTube channel, where we have many of our other training videos to help educate people into many of the unknown areas of fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. But for the meantime, can I thank Nick so much? Been lovely seeing you and lovely working with you, and long may it continue. All the best.
You're more than welcome. Thanks for having me.
Thanks very much indeed. Good night, everybody.